Chapter 7 User Interface and Scoring. In Chapter 7, we'll be creating the user interface and the scoring system, allowing the player to see how well they're doing, all within a script that we'll call the UI Manager. UI Managers are scripts which look after all elements of a game, which are outside the game world and its levels, often taking place in what we call screen space instead of the usual world space. Things like pop-up text, scores, menus, buttons, ammo counts, options, character dialogues, lives, etc. They can all be part of the UI Manager script. Once we have our UI set up, we'll also be writing the code to earn points. There are three main ways the player can earn points: jumping fires, barrels, smashing fires and barrels, and collecting the princess's dropped things. Before we begin coding our UI, let's set up what's needed in the editor first. We're going to use Unity's own inbuilt UI system to create our UI. Before we begin coding our UI, let's set up what's needed in the editor first. We're going to use Unity's own inbuilt UI system to create our UI. Create a new UI text by navigating to the Game Object menu, followed by UI, followed by text. Now create another 3 text UI objects and 4 image UI objects. Name the text UI objects Score, High Score, Level, and Bonus. Name the UI images Life 1, Life 2, Life 3, and Blossom. Time to format our new objects. Move the text objects to the top of the screen and make them larger, and set them to a more readable color. You may also think about finding a free font to use from the internet at this point. Set your image objects to a sprite which represents your lives, make them smaller and place them somewhere easy to see, but not in the way. Now that we have our UI elements set up, it's time to hook these elements up to some code and give them their actual value. Start by creating a new script and name it UI Manager. Then in the editor, attach the new script to the main camera in the hierarchy. Next, we need to add our libraries. This time, as well as generic, we'll also be adding Unity's UI library, which allows us access to UI variable types, such as text. Our UI Manager will require a bunch of asset variables, along with some actual variables. Let's add them now. The bonus amount of points you get for finishing a level changes for each set of 10 levels, thus giving you more time to linger in each level if you dare. Here, we'll create a function to set the starting amount of bonus points depending on the level you're on. Next, we'll add the function for adding points to the player's score. We're going to need a way for other scripts to grab the current level as it's stored here in the UI Manager privately. We're also going to need a way to increase the level. Now, navigate over to the player script and include the generic library. We're going to need to add a list variable. Then add the following new variables to the player script. Next, we need to create a reference to the UI Manager within the start function of the player script. Next, we'll add a new public function to control the player's current lives from other scripts. When the player spawns, we take a life because we're using that life. Add the following into the player's start function. And of course, when the player loses a life, we have to reset many variables to be able to respawn fresh. We want our life sprites to accurately represent how many lives we have left. To do this, we'll write a new function in the UI Manager script. Now that we have scoring, we need to make sure the high score is saved. The bonus points the player earns for completing a level needs to tick down each time a barrel is spawned. Navigate back over to the level factory script. We have some new variables to add while we're there. In the level factory start function, we need to grab a reference to the UI Manager. Now that we have the tick bonus points function in the UI Manager, our barrels can finally use it. So let's head on over to the level factory script and uncomment out the tick bonus points function call at the bottom of the barrel spawn function. We still need to restart the level when the player dies. This means removing all the barrels, repositioning the player back to his default spawn position, resetting the bonus points, and subtracting a life. Turn back to the UI Manager script. When the player reaches the gum nut at the top of the level, he needs to be rewarded with the remaining bonus points before starting the next level. Now we need to make sure that our variables are initialized when the game starts. And finally, we need to make sure the scores are being passed into the UI text objects each frame. Now we need to hook up all the public asset variables with the created UI objects from part 1 and to create one last prefab. So assign all the rest of the text and image UI objects into the asset variable slots for them in the main camera's UI Manager component. When the player gains some points, we announce this via spawning the number of points you just earned as a pop-up. We need to create that prefab object. Now that we have the UI set up and ready to roll, we need to code in our events for actually earning the points. Back in Chapter 6, Part 4, we coded the hammer object. Inside the hammer script, within the onTriggerEnter2D function, you will find two to-do lines. These represent the locations we're about to start working. But first, a hammer is going to require a reference to the newly created UI Manager. And we will initialize the reference by adding the following into the hammer start function. Over the top of the first to-do, we'll add the code that gives you points for smashing barrels with the hammer. And over the top of the second to-do, add the code which gives you points for smashing living fires. Every time the player runs over one of the princess's things, he gains points based off the level bracket he's currently in. 100 points for the first 10 levels, 300 points for the next 10, 500 for the 10 after that, and then any that come after that, a massive 800 points. So first, within the player script, we'll write the onTrigger function for collecting the princess's things. The final kind of points you can earn in the game is for successfully jumping over barrels and fires. When we jump over something, we don't get the points until we land, which means we need to save each object we've passed in a list. We'll call this list point cache. Here, we're caching in any objects that are in the list. Navigate to the player's script, and within the move function we wrote back in Chapter 2 Part 3, uncomment out the following lines in bold. Our next function is going to need a new variable. We have our score cache list set up, and we cache in points when we jump. Now all we need is a function that adds objects we've jumped into that list. And finally, add a call to score check into the player's update underneath Move. Congratulations, you've finished Chapter 7. If you've done everything correctly, you should now be able to save, compile, and run your project. Playtest your game and start jumping over everything and smashing everything with that hammer